Hi and welcome to another disassembly tutorial. In today's episode, for the next 40 minutes roughly, I'm gonna take apart the Canon 600D, also known as KISS X5 and T3i. So as always, the first step is to take the battery out of the camera. So next is to take the Viewfinder eyepiece. Next step will be taking off the rubbers. That was the back. This is the side. This camera it's quite used, so was disassembled several times. So the rubber comes off quite easily. So next step is to take the side cover, a left side cover. So on this side there are slightly different screws. There are three of them are the same. For example, this one is different than the other ones. This is slightly longer and a different color. The other three screws are all the same. When you take the, you need to disconnect or take the plastics off. I do recommend to use a plastic tool and another metallic tool in order to not to damage the plastics. Okay, so the next step is to take the back of the camera off. I'm taking the battery door off here. So the screws here, some are the same, some are different. For example, this one is slightly different than the other ones. This is a long screw, and the threading on the screw is different than these other ones. These are short and with normal thread. Again, this is the same. And this last screw on the back here also is slightly different than the other ones. So keep in mind that the screws, the way you place the screws and put the screws in the order you keep off your screws in order to not create any mistakes. So the next step is on the side, taking the screws off from the side. This, as you can see, is slightly longer. And again, this is different than the one before. Be careful when you're about to disconnect this back. There's a flat connector. Actually, there are two flat connectors. It's one for the buttons command and the other one for the LCD screen. Again, I do recommend to use a plastic tool here. And also to place the cover in this way in order to not create any damage during the disassembly. Be very careful with this connector, it's quite fragile. Okay, so we have our back off. Next step will be to take parts off from the back, in order to show you how to replace parts. So next step will be to take off the LCD screen. I will, by doing this, I'm taking off the complete screen off. There was a cover, so the screw I took off, took it off that cover. I do recommend to use this place the wire very gently. Move the wire again, the next cover. So now we have the screws for disconnecting the whole LCD screen from the back. These two screws are both the same. So here, very gently, you have to cross the connector and the cable of the LCD. There's you're gonna see there's one way to do it, and do not create any force when you are taking this wire off. So the next step will be to take off the LCD screen from its cover. So I'm going to take the covers of the screen bracket. All these four screws are all the same, so there's no way to miss them. So again, you have to use a plastic tool in order to not create any kind of damage over here. Please remember that the position of these covers are different. Okay, so the next step is by taking off the cover in order to reach the LCD screen. By doing that, we need to take these two screws off. These two screws are both the same. So next are another two screws, one on this side and another one on this other side. Okay, so in order to take the cover off, again you need to use a plastic tool in order to not create any damage. So this is the back cover. So here we have the other end of the cable that connects with the LCD screen. In order to continue the disassembly, we need to take off these other two screws. Okay, so now we are about to take all this connector with the hinge and the positioning sensors. Actually, they are contactors. So if you have problems with rotating the screen of the camera, you need to replace that whole thing, cable and hinge, screen hinge. So next step will be to take the LCD screen off. Okay, so this is the LCD. The last thing that we need to do over here is to take the LCD driver, the little board that stays on the back of the LCD screen. So you need to do it as I am doing it, but I do recommend to use some heat in order to warm up a bit the back of the LCD, and in that way you're gonna be able to take it off easier than I'm doing it right now. As you can see, I'm struggling a bit just because the double tape, there's a double side tape underneath, and it is quite strong. Anytime you have to do something when you need to use force, try to not create too much force. If it's too much, I do recommend to make a step back and try to either hit up in this, like in this case, hit up the screen and repeat the process, but do not create any kind of force, especially here, because we have the back of the screen, and it's we risk to damage the screen, damage the light or the backlight of the screen, or either crack the glass of the screen itself. Okay, so now we separate the two parts. This is the only LCD screen, and this other one here is the driver of the LCD screen. So if you have problems with the LCD screen, you might have a damaged driver, or even a damaged a faulty connection cable. So continuing with the disassembly of the back of the camera, next step is to take off this metallic part that holds the LCD. Next is to take the buttons. I believe this is the menu button. Again, using the proper tool. Okay, so next we're gonna reach the other buttons of the back of the camera. In case you need to replace, you have a damage button, malfunction button. This is the way to do it. All these screws here are all the same. Okay, disconnecting this the flat cable. That's the button, all buttons connecting with the two flat cables. Again, you do not need to use any force in order to take the parts off. Okay, so this is these are all the buttons of the back of the camera. So if you need to replace that, now you know how to do it. Next step will be to take the continuing to disassemble the main flat cable, flat connector. This is the plastic that for the LED memory card reader. Okay, so this is the rest of the parts left for the back of the camera. So if you need to replace this flat connector, now you know how to do it. Taking off the last parts remain, menu and info. And this is these are the other plastic parts. Okay, so since we are here, as the last thing we need to take off is the battery door, SD card battery door. We need to slide that pin completely out, and the door, now it's off. So okay, so we finished the back of the camera. Now we're continuing with the disassembly of the rest of the camera. The next step is by taking off the top. And first thing we need to do is to take the front cover. So these two screws are both the same. This might be different. So one very important step to do next is, once you take this cover off, is to discharge the capacitor, which unfortunately I'm not doing straight away in this tutorial. So this screw, it's quite hard to take it off. I did recommend to have a really good screwdriver in order to not create any damage to the screws while disassembling the camera. So as you can see, the last step for taking the cover off is by disconnecting that tripod position screw. Okay, so now we have the back, the front of the camera off. Next will be is by taking off the top. Again, these two screws are different, one to another. Remember to disconnect this screw, otherwise you're not going to be able to take the top of the camera off. Okay, so these two screws here are both the same. Disconnecting that left connector. I already disconnected the main connector. If you didn't notice it, I used the plastic tool. Okay, so the next step will be the motherboard. Disconnecting all the flats connectors. You can see this one, it's in a different position. So in order to take these two flats off, you're gonna need a sort of a bullet head. I just found out something that fits. Okay, so next step is by taking off the screws from the for the motherboard that holds the motherboard. So these screws are all the same. Okay, so you have to flip the motherboard in this way in order to disconnect that cable. So now the motherboard is free. You can take this metallic cover off in case you need it. Okay, so the next step will be by taking off the card reader. You have to be very careful over here. Another connector. And a few screws. These screws are all the same. Okay, so very gently, without using any force, You have now the SD card reader. That's the flat connector that connects with the motherboard. If you need to replace it, this is the way to do it. I definitely recommend to take this part off in order to replace the flat connector. You still can replace it by with the board connected, but it's a bit more difficult. So next step, I am taking the image sensor here. So there are two Phillips screwdriver screws, and next there are T T screw head. So on this model also Canon decided to put their spring image sensor with springs instead of spacers, and I believe Canon on the last models will continue using this kind of system rather than the spacers, because it's way easier. The bad thing for us is that we need, every time this the image sensor is disassembled, the calibration is required. So for doing that at home, it's quite impossible. You either need the calibration tool, or otherwise, the way I used to do it in the past, I was doing the job and then sending the camera to Canon for calibration. Definitely the cost will be way less than the cost of replacing the whole thing to the Canon. Okay, so now I'm discharging the capacitor, which it's a bit too late. I am quite lucky that I didn't create any damage to the camera, and I didn't take any shock from the capacitor. But definitely I do recommend to take the discharged capacitor as soon you take off the cover of the front of the camera. So now I'm disconnecting the wires. Keep in mind the position of every wire, otherwise you may risk to create damage. So there are two there's a it's kind of a silicone protection for that connection. Disconnecting the other wires. So the best way to take this kind of connector off is from the front, from the head, and not from the back, because from the back you risk to broke the pins of the connector itself. Okay, so next step is by taking off the mirror box and disconnecting um, the middle frame of the camera from the rest of the parts, rest of the parts left, basically. These screws are all the same. Be very careful when you handle this kind of flat cables. Okay, so now I took apart the power board and the battery compartment. Next step, I will take the separate the two parts. These two screws are both the same. Actually, all three of them. There is a double tape over here. You have to pull very gently in order to disconnect it. Otherwise, you risk to broke the flat cable. Okay, so this is the power unit and the flash power. This is basically Canon on this model decided to put both on the same component. Be very careful with this part because you might lose it. It comes off really easy, and you might not notice when you take apart the this part. Okay, so now we continue with finishing the um, taking apart the rest of the parts left. So this is the microphone connector. If you need to replace this, this is the way to do it. If you need to replace this little flat cable, this is the way to do it. I do recommend to be very careful. Okay, so next step is by taking off the bottom side, the bottom plate that acts also as holding the other parts and for the um, tripod mount when you need to fix the camera. So if you have a damaged tripod screw connector, um, you need to replace this part. The last screws for disconnecting, for separating the metal part from the um, mirror box. be careful with that flat connector. And again, do not use any force here. Okay, so this is the middle frame, metal middle frame of the camera. Okay, so the next step is by taking off the shutter. Okay, so before starting taking off the screws, remember to disconnect this spring, which I'm gonna do it next. This is the spring that push on the mirror box. So definitely, when you have to take off the shutter, you have to disconnect this part, and once you place it back in or replace it, remember to put it back, otherwise you're gonna have giving error from the camera. So the shutter is held, as you already seen, the shutter is held by 2 screws. Very gently here as well. So if you have problems to put this the shutter back on the camera, sometimes you might struggle to put it back. I do recommend to take the viewfinder off and place the shutter, and then put the viewfinder back. Okay, so the next step is the viewfinder. These screws are all the same. Alright, so this is the last part of this tutorial. As last thing, I'm going to show you how to take the viewfinder focusing screen off. Definitely you don't need to take apart the camera to reach this part. This is the focusing screen. Be careful not to touch the viewfinder, otherwise the focusing screen, otherwise you're gonna damage it. So if you're still here, I will really appreciate you like, share and subscribe to this channel. I will try my best to put new content on the channel. And if you have any question, use the comment section below, and I will try to answer to all your questions. Thank you again for watching, and see you next time.